Hello, and welcome to Bristol Legal. My name is Elizabeth Nowakowski, Associate Professor of Paralegal Studies at Bristol Community College. Today, we are very excited to have a guest that is going to discuss immigration law, a topic that is very controversial, hot, we have attorney Schuyler Pisha with us. He is a legal director of immigration programs at Catholic Social Services of Fall River. Briefly, maybe you can tell us what does your organization do and how you can help those that need help.
Sure. So Catholic Social Services of Fall River does all kinds of services for all kinds of low-income and needy people throughout the Fall River Diocese, which includes Barnstable County, Bristol County, the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, and a little slice of Plymouth County as well. In my department, which is the only legal department, we represent low-income immigrants in the diocese. We represent probably around 650 to 700 people a year, which is a lot, but given the size of our area that we serve and the extent of the need, it's really a drop in the bucket, so we end up turning away a lot of people away. And the services we give are basically the full panoply of immigration legal services that low-income immigrants might need, becoming citizens, getting green cards, fighting deportation, getting out of detention, specialized services for survivors of domestic violence, trafficking, child abuse, other crimes. So a range of different immigration legal services.
So if we were to do an immigration 101, so to say, immigration law 101, can you remind our audience how does one become a U.S. Maybe resident, legal resident?
Sure.
Because citizen, whichever way you'd like to go. Yeah.
I think the way I usually start the conversation is there's many different types of immigration status, but if you want to boil it down to the most basic, you start from people who are undocumented. Undocumented means that you have no legal status in this country. Usually people think of people who entered the country illegally, generally through the southern border, but many, many people who are undocumented in this country, and certainly the biggest expanding group are people who have come here on a visa or from a country where they don't need a visa and then have overstayed that visa, have continued to be in the country after their legal stay has expired. So in this area, there's many, many people who have come from Portugal, which is very easy. You don't need a visa to enter from Portugal to enter the United States, and people have remained past the period they're allowed to stay. So that's undocumented. People are undocumented. They have constitutional rights in this country. They have certain rights to fight deportation. They may have a right to stay based on this country's national and international obligations not to repatriate people to places where they'll be harmed. Beyond that, kids will have a right to K through 12 education, but there's no right to work legally. Contrary to popular belief, undocumented immigrants are not collecting public benefits. They're not eligible for food stamps. They're not eligible for cash benefits. And mostly people are working in the underground economy. There's also legal permanent residents, more commonly known as green card holders. These are people who have most of the rights of a citizen, but it's a little bit different. You can't be on a jury. You can't hold certain political office. You can't vote. But in general, it's pretty much like being a citizen, except that you can easily be deported if you break immigration or criminal laws. For example, 2 shoplifting convictions could end up getting a green card holder deported. In between being undocumented and being green card holder, that's where we have statuses like DACA, like TPS. And those statuses, not as good as being green card holder, not as bad as being undocumented. People who have TPS, people who have DACA, commonly called the Dreamers, these individuals have a right to work in the country temporarily for a renewable period of 18 months or 2 years, depending on the status. With that work card in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island, they would also have the right to apply for a driver's license, and probably not to be deported as long as they stay within the law during that time. And it's a process where they would routinely undergo criminal background checks. It doesn't lead anywhere. It's sort of an immigration dead end. It's a very vulnerable place to be, and there's no real direct pathway in between having DACA or having TPS and becoming a permanent resident. So there's a number of ways people can become a permanent resident, but the vast majority of undocumented people just are not eligible. So it's not that people don't want to become legal permanent residents or they're not willing to take the steps. It's for most people, there just is not a pathway. For certain people, there may be, if they have certain immediate relatives who can sponsor them, who are U.S. citizens, who are green card holders, if they're victims of certain crimes, or if they've been persecuted in their home countries or would face persecution in their home countries. So there's these narrow ways that certain undocumented people can become legal permanent residents, green card holders, and then from green card holders eventually become citizens. It's a narrow pathway, and that's a lot of work that we try to do, is help people navigate that narrow pathway for those who are eligible.
And there's also the group that is on work visas, right? So
right. Well, there are people who are on work visas, like a temporary work visa.
Yeah.
It's not something we work with a lot, but there's seasonal visas. You see a lot of this in the Cape, on the islands, where in season there's a big need for workers, and a lot of people come from the Caribbean, from Eastern Europe, to work on Nantucket, to work on Martha's Vineyard, to work on the Cape for the summer on a temporary basis and return to their home country. You see similar things at the ski resorts. The idea is that there's just not enough people living on Nantucket to address the needs in the summer, so that's a temporary work benefit.
So immigration law has always been a very mysterious field to many,
yes.
But it really has come up to the top of many discussions in the last year since the new administration came to power, if I can say so. And last year it started obviously with the executive orders, and then with DACA, et cetera. But if we can certainly talk about the policies, but we only have limited number of times. I'd like to bring it home, sort of, and see how do you see the landscape changing, and even Bristol County, or even in Massachusetts. How do these decisions or policy changes or mentality, or how is it impacting what you do, and is it impacting the community, the undocumented,
it's affecting everybody. I mean, I think,
those that without permanent residency.
Sure.
Let's put it this way.
For starters, across the board, because of their rhetoric, because of the complexity, because of the hyperbole, not everybody, but people of all statuses are terrified. And I end up having meetings with clients that I haven't met with for several months because I don't need to. Their case is on track. They're legal permanent residents, or they have asylum, or their case is in great shape. And I meet with them, and it turns out they've been terrified for the last 6 months. I haven't checked in with them because there's really nothing to do in their case. They're in great shape from a legal perspective, but everybody's scared, even people who maybe shouldn't be. And a lot of people really should be scared, and they're scared for a good reason. And we'll talk about that. So, changing the substantive law in immigration is incredibly difficult. It's politically fraught. It's why we never make any progress. There's no compromise. But there's a lot of things that the president can do on his own. Among those things is DACA. DACA was something that President Obama did basically by executive order. It'd be controversial the whole time. It was litigated, but never really settled whether that was legal or not. Kind of got punted around. And then the Trump administration decided to end DACA. It's not enshrined in law. It was a presidential decision. Similar with TPS. I'll start with the example. I think in this area, the biggest groups are certainly Haitian TPS, El Salvadoran TPS, Honduran TPS. A lot of people affected by those. And the way TPS works is people who had come to this country or had been present in this country when certain catastrophic events happened in their home country, they were given respite and allowed to stay on a renewable 18-month cycle, basically. So in the case of El Salvador, which I believe is the biggest TPS group, TPS for El Salvador started in 2001, was continued throughout subsequent presidents from both parties, up until now. Trump's announced that it's going to sunset in July of 2019. So what that means is that these hundreds of thousands of Salvadoran people who have been here since 2001 are going to lose their right to work lawfully in this country in July of 2019. Doesn't mean they all are going to necessarily leave the country. Probably most of them won't. Doesn't mean they're all going to be deported, but they're going to lose their right to work lawfully and their right to drive lawfully with that once they lose that work card. Many of these people have U.S. citizen children. I mean, they've been here for 18 years. Their U.S. citizen children may be not really even exactly children anymore, young adults, teenagers. So in some cases, those adult children may be able to sponsor these people for status. Often they won't. I have no idea what those people are going to do. Salvadoran, Haitian TPS holders, we anticipate the same thing will happen with Honduran TPS holders. They're likely not going to go back to their home country, and they're going to lose their right to work legally. Many of them have had great jobs for a long time. So I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know what the administration would like them to do. From my perspective, if you need to feed a family, and you can't work legally, I don't know what option is better. There's working illegally, there's stealing, there's trying to get public benefits, which their U.S. citizen children may be entitled to. None of those seems to me to be a better option than lawfully working. And whether TPS ends or not, many of these people probably have no intention of going back to Haiti or El Salvador, bringing their teenage U.S. citizen children back to a country where they'll have far less opportunities. That's a long answer, but it's an important issue.
Well, yeah, and then we have courts. What's happening in courts?
Right.
I mean,
so I think the other big change that the president can do on his own is kind of setting priorities for enforcement actions. So under the Obama administration, especially towards the tail end, Obama set very clear priorities about who would be arrested and deported. There's about 12 million people here illegally in the country or undocumented who are technically may or may not be deportable, but could have enforcement action taken against them. The government doesn't have close to the resources that it would take to do that, despite what Trump implied during the election. And so basically the Obama administration set priorities. We're going to go primarily after people with criminal records, sometimes even very minor criminal records, but that was basically who was being deported for the large part under the Obama administration, especially in the interior of the country. I'm not talking about border enforcement, a little different, but what we've seen in the Trump administration is that the Trump administration is trying to boost the numbers of deportations and immigration arrests, but they don't necessarily have a lot more resources at this point. So what we've seen from the numbers is that and this is ICE's own data that's available online, there's been a slight increase in the amount of arrests of immigrants who have a criminal record, minor criminal record or major criminal record, maybe a few percentage points. What's really gone up a lot are arrests of people with no criminal record whatsoever. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because this is the low-hanging fruit. These are the easy people to arrest if you want to arrest as many people as possible and you don't care who you're arresting and you want to do it on the cheap. So I'll give you a good example. I have a client who was in the Bianco factory raid in New Bedford about 10, 11 years ago. We fought her case for a long time. We were not able to win her case. She has a deportation order. Under the Obama administration, basically, every year she would go and check in with the equivalent of a probation officer. It's like an ICE probation officer. She'd go to Burlington, Massachusetts, and they would do a background check, ensure that she had no criminal record. This woman, she's in her young 30s. She came when she was a teenager to the United States. She has 2 U.S. citizen children. She's been in the United States for 20 plus years with absolutely no criminal record. And under the Obama administration, they said, they'd run a background check every year, say, okay, come back in a year. Under the Trump administration, they've said, okay, come back in a month and bring airplane tickets to fly back to Mexico. If you don't, we're going to arrest you and send you back. Now, she doesn't seem like a high priority. It seems really inhumane to do this to her. But if you only care about the amount of people you deport, it makes perfect sense because she's compliant. They order her to come and check in and come to their office, and she does it. And so that makes it very easy to interact with her, to arrest her, to pressure her to leave the country on her own or take her into custody. She's not the sort of person they would put together a 5-person team of armed ICE agents and go kick in her door. It's really not worth it. But since she's compliant and comes to them when they ask her to, and she follows what the government tells her to do, it makes her extremely vulnerable, easy to deport. She's low-hanging fruit, and that's the way the ICE is going to get their numbers out, is by arresting those people who basically are willing to come to them as they're instructed to do. So
currently in terms of the what's the word I'm looking for? The feeling is it's fear. It's really fear what's happening in the communities, and people are really afraid to leave their homes, to go to churches, to go to courts, to go to. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain. I think at the very beginning we saw people not going to school, not going to church, not going to work. I think to a large extent that's unsustainable, and people just live with a huge amount of anxiety when they leave the house. But they face that. But they feel that they're at risk when they do that, and they are. In general, we're not going to see enforcement actions done in churches, in hospitals, in schools. That's a long-standing government policy, basically meant to protect public relations image of ICE, because it kind of looks bad when you start going to churches and grabbing parishioners out of the pews, so there's a policy against that. Likewise, they don't really come into schools and arrest people in general. But people are vulnerable all the time. And
so you mentioned earlier that you don't see that as many raids anymore, or do you still see those? Because that's a huge impact on families if your parents go to work and they don't come back.
Well, I think what we haven't seen, I mean, basically, especially in this area, but I think across the country in general, the Bianco raid was seen as a disaster. That was when the Bianco leather factory in New Bedford, Mass. was raided. I think around 360 people were arrested, brought to a military base. Our agency, before I was there, took many of those cases, won many of those cases, continues to represent many of those individuals. It was extremely unpopular after it happened. It was catastrophic, and you can kind of imagine why. You arrest 360 people in a community, and just the logistics of it, if you don't care about the humanitarian toll, which I certainly do, the logistics are overwhelming. So you had kids, a number of kids, whose parents just didn't show up to pick them up. So, you're in a New Bedford public school, and no one came to pick up this kid, and you don't really know what to do. What are you supposed to do with a kid? And it's horrible. And the schools can't just release kids to a well-meaning neighbor, so these kids are in danger of ending up in DCF custody. Just logistically and humanitarianly, from a humanitarian perspective, it was just awful. There's cars that are just sitting on the street and no one's moving them. There's apartments that are essentially abandoned and no one's paying their rent. And so it becomes beyond a humanitarian crisis. It impacts a community, people in the community who are not immigrants, or not even necessarily sympathetic. It's just a horrible way to operate. And so the government's kind of moved away, for the most part, away from large-scale workplace raids like that, because they were so unpopular. So things are usually done more on a case-by-case basis, raiding people's homes instead of their workplaces. We do see workplace raids sometimes, usually smaller than that.
Yeah, that's. Then what about another 101 of Know Your Rights?
Yeah.
I know, I'm not sure if any one is watching to whom it may apply, but I think it's a good thing for any resident and citizen of this country to know. What are some of the things that you can talk to us about, that would apply to both, especially those who are here undocumented, about driving or letting people into your house?
Right. So, I mean, I think from a know your rights perspective, what's important is that people who are undocumented in this country, they have the same set of constitutional rights as anyone else. And those constitutional rights include the right to decide who enters your home and to not be unlawfully taken into custody. So the advice I would give to people and do give to people who are undocumented is not unlike what any other lawyer might advise somebody. Basically, if anyone comes to your house that you'd rather not have in your house, you do not have to let them into your house. And they might tell you have to let them in, and they might threaten you, but you don't have to let them in. And in general, if the police come to your house, they're going to generally come with a warrant. In the United States, there's at least two kinds of warrants, sort of three, but in this case, there's a different distinction between an arrest warrant and a search warrant. An arrest warrant gives the police or ICE the right to arrest somebody. A search warrant would give them the right to come into your home. ICE can get what's called an administrative arrest warrant, where basically they don't have to go to a judge like a police officer might, but they can go to just their boss and get something signed so that they can go arrest a particular individual. That doesn't give them the right to come into somebody's home. And though ICE could go to a court and get a warrant for that, I've never seen that happen. Generally, ICE will come to someone's house. They will use deception or intimidation to gain permission to enter. Usually that's by saying, if you don't open the door, we're going to kick the door in, we're going to come in, which generally they will not, because they're not lawfully allowed to do that. Another thing is, if they're looking for John Smith, they're going to say, we're looking for Jane Doe. We just want to come in and talk about Jane Doe. We're not going to arrest John Smith. Just let us in to talk about Jane Doe. We won't arrest you. You open the door, let them in to talk about Jane Doe, and they arrest John Smith and take him away. That's lawful for them to do. They're allowed to lie. If you lie to ICE, you can get in big trouble if you're an immigrant, but if ICE lies to you, that's perfectly legal. And so people should be aware that they have a right to not open the door, to not let people into their home, and that they should refuse to do so if they don't want to.
And similar to when they're driving, right? Because when you get stopped and you don't have a license or any kind of ID, that presents, even if I am here legally, if I don't have a license.
Yeah, driving is a little bit of a different situation, because unlike walking down the street or being in your home, when you're driving a vehicle, you are legally obligated to have a license to drive a vehicle. Undocumented people, for the most part, they're not eligible to have a driver's license. So unfortunately, when they're taking their kids to school, driving to work, going to the doctor, going to church, going to the pharmacy, they're violating that law. They're committing what could be a misdemeanor, or usually is just a civil penalty. But when you're pulled over driving a vehicle, a police officer certainly has a right to ask you for your driver's license, and they will do that. And if you have no driver's license, what I always recommend is that people do present a passport or any other ID that they have in that situation. When you're driving a car and you're pulled over, you do not have to do that on the street. Nobody has any right to know where you're from, or that's your own business. You don't have to have ID to walk down the street in the United States. When you're driving a car, you do need a driver's license. And if you're pulled over, you do not have a driver's license, the police basically have a choice. They can arrest you, or they can give you a citation to appear in court. If you're pulled over and you have no identification whatsoever, the police are most likely going to take you into custody so they can fingerprint you and determine your identity, because no police officer wants to pull over a serial killer and then let them go because they took the person's word for it about who they were. So if you have a passport from another country and you're driving, you're probably better off showing that to a police officer so they can verify your identity, check you for warrants without arresting you and fingerprinting you. Because once you're arrested and fingerprinted, ICE will find out about the arrest, the fingerprints will be sent through the FBI database, which also will alert ICE. So when people are driving, I recommend they have some form of ID if they do not have a license.
Which is an interesting segue to my next question. We probably don't have enough time to talk about sanctuary cities, but
right.
This whole relationship between being in a custody and ICE being notified, there was
Sure.
a lot of talk about it. Can you?
That's a
what's the latest?
One.
Yeah, it's
a complicated one. So.
You have 30 seconds.
And again,
I'm just kidding.
I'm not an expert on the legislative side,
of course.
And I do follow it, but it's not directly the work I do. So I'm not certainly not an expert and don't have up to the minute information. But
how it applies to you? What do you see?
Yeah, well,
right?
people misunderstand sanctuary cities and think it means a lot more than it does. So basically, as I explained, anytime you're arrested by any law enforcement in any city, sanctuary city, non-sanctuary city, you're going to be fingerprinted. And those fingerprints are going to be sent to the FBI. And it's going to go through the ICE database, and ICE will be alerted if there's a match. Sanctuary city, non-sanctuary city, that's everywhere. The question is, what happens next typically would be that ICE would decide if they want to request that the police hold that person in custody for them because ICE would like to interrogate them or arrest them for immigration purposes. So I'm driving a car, I don't have a license, I don't have any ID, I get arrested, I get fingerprinted, it dings on ICE's computer, they send a fax over to the Fall River Police and say, will you please hold Mr. Pisha for us when you're done with him so that we can come get him. Typically, a sanctuary city would refuse that request or only accept that request for people who have a criminal record or a certain kind of criminal record. That's what makes it a sanctuary city. Now, what the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court has said, and I think they're correct, is that Massachusetts police are not lawfully able to honor those detainer requests from ICE because if I'm taken into custody because I'm driving without a license, and I've been cleared of that, or I've paid my bail, there's no legal justification for the police to continue to hold me. They cannot hold me just because the federal government would like them to. I write against unlawful restraint, against being arrested arbitrarily. So if there's no legal justification under criminal law that allows the police to hold me, they cannot do it just because I said so. That's where we are right now in Massachusetts. ICE can say, okay, well, you just tell us when you're going to let him out so we can arrest him when he leaves the building. Sure, they can continue to do that. They can also arrest me when I go to court, for my hearing about the driver's license. We see that happening a lot. So that's sort of where we're at. Massachusetts is not honoring detainer requests from ICE right now. The information still gets back to them. There's still other ways they can take people into custody.
So can individual cities still honor those requests? I mean, can the police departments?
Can they elect to hold people?
Mm-hmm. Or would it be?
No, I mean, the SJC has said no. If you don't have a justification under Massachusetts law to hold somebody, you cannot. I mean, the police can't just come and arrest me because they want to or hold me because they want to. There has to be a legal justification. And because the federal government wants us to is not a legal justification.
Well, I think we are pretty much out of time.
It goes so fast. I could talk about this forever.
And this is, it feels like we just scratched the surface with some of the issues. I mean, this is such a serious issue, impacts so many lives. How many people do we have in Massachusetts that are undocumented? How many do we think?
I wish I knew. I really couldn't tell you. I think there's not great data about this. I mean, I wouldn't even hazard a guess. I know we've tried to figure out things like this for different grant opportunities, and there's a lot of guesswork that goes into it. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands. Yeah. We don't know how many.
Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really
we're going to have to have part 2 of this.
Anytime.
Things change, they're fluid.
Yes.
So we'll have, hopefully you won't mind coming back and speaking with us and giving us another update because there is so much to learn.
Anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching, and watch out for another episode of Bristol Legal. And as always, if you have any suggestions on topics or guests you'd like to see, shoot me an email. Thank you very much. you.